So good morning, everyone. If we could go ahead and get started. I don't think we should use Robert Rules of Order. There's 4 of us, but can we agree that I'm going to be the facilitator? Yeah, and that Ben will be our note taker, and that Talia will be our timekeeper. And so if right now the time is 9:48, that means we'll go until 10:48 potentially with item 1. But can we agree that if we need more time or less time, we can move on as needed? Okay. And that gives us 15 minutes per item.
As long as she's taking part, I just want to make sure she's good.
She's in here.
Oh, she's not in there.
No.
Okay.
Oh,
And so I also, since we do have a member of the public, I was wondering if we could introduce ourselves briefly, just maybe who we are and our role. So our member of the public can understand who they're seeing. And then member of the public, if you'd like to also introduce yourself, you're welcome to at any time. Would you like to do that? I think it's Miss Crane.
can she hear us?
Can you hear us? This is a good tech
Oh,
check.
yeah.
Yeah, she is.
Okay, you're welcome to introduce yourself if you'd like, or if you don't want to, you can wave us off. But we can't see the chat, so I just want to let you know that ahead of time, that if you do enter something into the chat, we can't see it. It's okay. Okay.
Okay, no
Okay,
problem.
and they said you
No
can't
problem.
speak. That's completely fine. We're going to introduce ourselves to you because you matter. And so my name's Kathleen Rowley. I'm a high school English teacher, and I'm here as one of the teachers as part of the work group. Yeah.
I'm Kathy Kracia. I work for the University of Southern California. All things accreditation and credentialing, and I'm here as a TPA or a performance assessment expert.
Big deal.
Hello, my name is Talia Cataño. I am here also as a classroom teacher. I teach social studies high school.
Hi, Ben Odell. I work at Sacramento County Office of Education as director of the intern program here. But prior to that, I was a teacher or admin for the last 20 years here in Sacramento. And then Tina,
I told Tina to join this.
she
one.
did join, and I don't see her anymore. She was here though,
She was there.
but she's not now.
Oh, she was good. I told her to group too. So she probably think because she saw
Oh, that makes sense.
she saw
yeah.
Marsha. Is Marsha your name? Would you mind turn off your camera because our panel online got confused. Thank you so much.
Okay, but we're still happy you're here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Tina. Yeah.
So as we get ourselves oriented, I'm going to go over the norms while we wait for Tina. We're going to be present. We're going to be on time. We're also going to be on time because we will need a bio break in an hour. Thank you for giving and receiving warm and cool feedback so that we can continue to improve. Thank you for speaking your truth, assuming positive intents, but also taking responsibility. Thank you for noticing the power dynamics in the room. And please step up and step back. We will be sure not to take up too much or too little space. We will Goldilocks this. Just the right amount. And so as we move forward today, and take notes, also if we could add a little bit to the norms, then if we are going too fast, too slow, too much, will you please let us know?
I will.
Okay, because we don't really have a norm for that. And so if it's okay with everyone, let's start with round 1, focus area 1. Tina, hi.
Done.
glad
Hi,
you're
Tina.
here.
I keep getting kicked out and in
I have
different.
to- I'm
Hopefully
sorry.
I'm going to
But
stay here now.
Yes.
You are in the
Okay.
right spot, Tina.
All right, good.
Yes, okay, so we're gonna start our timer. Tina, we just introduced ourselves to our public stakeholder who is present and went
Okay.
over the norms. But if you don't mind, can we start with focus area 1? Is that okay?
Yeah. Sounds
Yeah.
good.
So right now we are brainstorming possible attributes of the focus area concepts.
Okay.
And so if you take a look at handout 1-1, the focus area concepts are valid and authentic to the work of teaching, formative in nature. reasonable to implement in a wide range of classroom settings, appropriate for beginning teachers, and then any other concept. Should we start with 1A?
Mhm.
Okay. And so thinking these are, I think as has been said in previous places, these are very loaded words.
Yeah.
How shall we start eating this elephant?
One of the, on this sheet, I see they came up with sample questions for us to maybe address on that one. And so the first one is brainstorm possible attributes of the focus area concepts.
Okay, so let's talk about attributes of valid. An attribute, I know, right?
Yeah, I know. Right,
Sorry.
you're right.
No.
I'm wondering, could I
Take it to
suggest,
We
sorry,
tried
could I suggest we focus on authentic first and then valid? I think authentic is maybe
Okay,
easier to grasp. Valid,
agree.
That part.
I
okay.
strongly agree. And like they will be transcribing everything we say. So they'll just say flock of seagulls entered room and started screaming.
Is that what happened? Did I miss that?
No, it was my laughter. It was definitely just my cackle. So authentic. Attributes of authentic. Anything else?
The opposite of what I called out earlier. So I told this, Tina, I'm director of an intern program here in Sacramento. And I have seen while visiting classrooms that some folks might script out what they're going to say and have it on
Yeah.
a clipboard in front of them, or have things in the back of the room to look at as like a guide for what they need to do, or which doesn't necessarily scream to me as authentic teaching, right? But as I understand why they would do that, I'd probably take advantage of something like that too, to make sure I stay on. But at the same time, like that's not necessarily what I think of when I think of authentic. When I think of authentic, it's something that is happening daily. So you don't necessarily need the reminder in terms of like the assessment, something that you're already doing, something that's showing what you kind of stand for or what you do in your room. You know what I mean? Like,
Something organic.
yeah, organic.
And I think that's interesting because when we look at the design of any assessment for that matter, trying to capture what somebody does organically, yet also have the levels or the things that we need to look for or that we're saying we're calling out, right? So, and trying not to do a disservice to a candidate by not giving them the information of what we're going to be looking for. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I mean that there's that stretch, but I think organic and, to me, when I hear authentic, I think organic. I
Yes.
think what happens, like you say, day to day, without a script, without a plan, that kind of thing.
I just want to push back on the plan, though. I think we want teachers to have a plan for where they're going and what they're doing. So my understanding of the authentic is that they're there to teach. And the assessment is supposed to allow for them to capture teaching in a way that others can see it and make a determination that yes, they are ready to begin teaching and ready for a credential. So I guess I just want to make sure that we also think it is about like they're planning lessons. They have they have their objectives. They're going in a direction, and we're just capturing that.
Yeah, and I think to that point, because my maybe executive functioning skills are different than other people's, like the checklist in the back of the room, something like that, those small details to me don't necessarily indicate not highly effective teaching, right? And so I don't want to disassociate authentic from differing executive functioning. So if your authentic is highly, highly scripted and planned because
Right.
it is effective for you, I don't want to necessarily negate that, right? But I think authentic would be more than once, because one day can be good, one day can be bad, right?
Uh-huh.
Authentic is flexible, if that makes sense, because you cannot anticipate having the same students in the same classroom over the course of even 4 weeks, right? In an actual public school, like if this teacher is in a public school.
And even the students are different
Every day. Oh, man.
You know,
And
for one.
first semester, 10th grade to second semester, they are different humans, right? And so I think those 2 points are really important, that it should be something, I think authentic is really over time, it needs to be flexible. It cannot be static. And I think that it needs to be something that does show over a period of time. I think a one day, one shot, and even as a national board certified educator, that one video might not be the most authentic thing, right? You need, maybe like more of a scope. Because
Yeah,
I
I would
don't-
agree. I was thinking along the same lines, in terms of flexibility. So like as I mentored, student teachers, we call it the ETPA teaching. And there's a moment where I need to think about, I'm communicating with you for you to think about what the needs of the students are, but you're so hyper focused on ETPA teaching. I have to do the ETPA teaching, and it does become formulaic. And I even
Right.
had a conversation this year where I told my student teacher, it's transactional with you and the students. The students are feeling like this is a constant thing where we've done the video so many times and it doesn't feel authentic. It feels like we need to fulfill this one requirement. And so authenticity for me would be like, if your classroom environment is requiring you to shift and change, that's authentic to teaching, because my first period is very different than my third. That's authentic teaching. I need to build the capacity to understand that this group of students gets it like this, but then I gotta shift for my third. And that's really difficult to do in a hyper stressful situation for a student teacher who is like, but I have to do the TPA. We understand that. But this was the first year where I kind of had a little glimpse of that. And I was like, how do I mediate the relationship between my students and my student teacher, and how they're missing the mark. They're not engaging authentically with my students. And I was like, you should build relationships. And they were like, but I got a TPA to do.
Yeah.
They gotta do assessments. They gotta do this high caliber, thinking. And that was detrimental to their relationship and the authenticity of my class, I would say.
So I'm wondering, because like, when I read this, authentic to the work of teaching, right? So, the ed TPA or TPAs in general, when we talk about the work of teaching, you obviously need to have a lesson plan.
Yeah.
That's work, right? So you do need a lesson plan. You do need to plan, obviously somewhat. And, being able to, as a beginning teacher, we're trying to assess if a teacher can get to know their students well enough to plan an appropriate lesson. So that would be work. And to me, that's an authentic requirement to have, right?
Yeah.
But I guess when we get into the discussion of like the other part, the soft things about teaching, the day-to-day in terms of, that nitty-gritty relationship building and the ability to shift when somebody throws a chair, I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Or that comment.
So, how do we get at that part, or that authenticity, that organic part of teaching? Because, and I think TPAs or assessments in general have consistently struggled with exactly that point.
I think to Ben's earlier point, that if there was an opportunity to, and I think the most successful educators have that moment of reflection. So authentic doesn't mean perfect.
Right.
Authentic means excellent effort, doing your best to be a highly qualified educator, which has certain categories that we're not even talking about yet. But then also authentic means looking back and reflecting and being honest about what worked and what didn't work. Because when you go back and you do the forensics, you can tell who's understanding what moves were made correctly and what needs work. And so I think authentic also means being honest about the flaws in the lesson. And so it's not a perfect lesson, but also like how you might the next time fix the flaws, which is, I think, so essential for that early career, those first 3 years, right? And so I wonder if my understanding of authentic is also like that level of honesty and reflection.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah, no, no.
I also want to add to something Tina said that is a really strong point, right? And I might be misconstruing this. Thank you. 4 minutes. I might be misconstruing this, but so all the things that they need to do in those video clips, as an example, are super important, super impactful to classroom, right? Like students need to have a learning target.
Yes.
Students need to, or learning objective, depending on the
Right.
district or school, right? Students need to have prior knowledge activated. Like these are super, they need to know the expectations. It becomes interesting because the way that it is developed, and this could just be my perception, it almost feels like a checklist instead of a rubric. And what I mean by that is teachers are treating it like, let me look at the back of the room. Did I give a learning target? Yes, I did. But it's not evaluating like the strength of that learning target. It's did I, right? It's like, did I activate prior knowledge? Did I do these things in the clip? Which is not to Tina's point, right? Like she talked about planning.
Yeah.
That's where I struggle with like, I think it could be authentic planning. I think right now the way that some candidates approach it is more like did I do these things? Because the way the rubric is spelled out and the way that like is less about the actual how well I did something and more did I do something?
So that goes into the issue of how, how do you assess it, right? And talking about the different assessors, right? You kind of have to give them something to look for in these clips. You have to give them something concrete to look for. So I think, again, designing an assessment inherently builds some of these things that don't lend themselves well to being able to assess authentic or organic teaching. I think, to be fair to the candidate, you have to give them a target, right?
You need to.
You have to, so.
And then the other thing is the 5-minute time span. To give that target
There you
makes it a
go.
little less authentic because you have to fit
Right.
like 4 things into 5 minutes. Right?
Exactly. So how do you do that? And again, I like the broad view of this because we kind of have to unpack and think, is that the best way?
Yeah.
Is that the best way? I don't know.
So Kathy, I'm just reading. I think this is such a valuable conversation that we're having. And I wanted to just right now, the words that I'm hearing that all of you are putting down to what is authentic, I think at this point, that's what we're supposed to be focusing on. Are we just fleshing out what do we mean by authentic? And then we need to do an analysis of any modifications of the current assessments to meet our understandings of authenticity. Is that right? Is that what we're doing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what they say.
So I love these words. So we want these assessments, then if I could just sum up what I'm hearing a little bit, that the modifications needed, or if there are any, they need to make sure that whatever we're asking test takers to do is that they're teaching what they would normally be doing in an organic way, that there would be flexibility over time, that there would be flexibility related to what happens on a daily basis, because you cannot anticipate, given who your students are, what they come in with that day, that there needs to allow for honesty in people's analysis of their teaching of what worked and what didn't work. There needs to be something built in to ensure that test takers are not just checking off a list, but they are actually engaged in evaluating the quality of what they are doing. Those are some of the words I heard you all saying.
You captured that perfectly. Thank you.
Thank you.
This helps me. You made my job
Yeah,
easy.
there you go.
I
Um,
see that Marcia has her hand up, one of our.
Oh,
I don't know.
No.
I don't think we're allowed to hear. Am I
Oh,
correct
can
in
we
what I
let
understood?
anybody in?
Can we?
Yeah.
Hear from public?
Are we allowed
don't
to
know.
allow public to comment?
Want me to go find out? Oh, I can't. Can I
Can we leave?
do that?
I think.
We
I think.
find out.
Oh,
Okay,
thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah.
That was the 15 minutes allocated for us to review a group and focus areas.
Okay, we got half.
We got one.
Half of it.
We got half of
That
one.
part.
Yeah.
Just for time, but again, it's up to.
Yeah,
us to-
I think
That's
so.
okay. I
Yeah.
think that's reasonable and yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to point out that like discussing what we know and have learned about this is getting folded in.
Oh, yeah.
Because I'm hearing people use really specific examples from their experiences. And so I'm wondering if we can continue to talk about the focus area concepts for another 15.
Sure.
And then maybe identify questions. And if the questions start surfacing early, it's really difficult to separate out like what we know
Right.
from our definitions.
Yeah.
Like if that's okay with the group.
No, you're right, because again, it's especially when we're talking about authentic and the way this word authentic to the work of teaching, that's a wide, it can mean anything.
Mhm.
We'll do a
Yeah.
Okay, another 15. Did we find out about answering?
Yeah,
the
so is what I assumed. So right now cannot be public comment, but there is a public comment section coming up soon.
Oh, okay.
So if there's any comments from the public, please like look at the like our agenda for the commission today. And that would be an opportunity to say you have a public comment and then they'll call on you and that would be a chance to make that public comment soon.
And I think they can also submit in writing as
Yes.
well.
So you could
don't
choose
just hang
verbal or
out.
writing, yeah.
Yeah. that would
Mhm.
work.
I'm sorry, I wish.
We do want to hear you,
Yeah.
but.
I know.
So,
The-
thank you, Ben.
I just break in, so the handout you all have on the table,
Mhm.
that you're reading, is that online too? I only have the handout.
I don't think this one's online.
I don't
Yeah.
think it's online. Do you want me to talk to Adam and see if we can get it to you?
Yeah.
Or I can take a
Okay.
picture
Oh, there you go.
and text it to Beverly, who can text it to you.
I could,
Oh, if you text Beverly, she can take a picture and send it to you.
okay.
He has one too.
There's not a slide of it, is there?
No.
Okay.
This is a public forum, so do not say your phone number out loud, is what I just
Yeah.
Or email.
Yeah.
Unless it's.
No. Yeah. There's 5 degrees of separation.
Did we move? I'm sorry, did we move?
We're going to, because we're kind of discussing what we know and have learned about each item as we're going through. So we're going to take another 15 minutes to continue talking about attributes. Can we agree that we have some ideas about what authentic may be?
Yeah.
And
Yes.
then as far as valid goes, I would propose that we do formative, reasonable, appropriate. And then I think that will actually help us come to better conclusions about valid.
Okay.
Right, because it would not be valid if it wasn't any of the other things. But then also like sidestepping the larger issue of valid as a PhD research.
So yeah, validity. I mean,
Yeah.
Yeah,
that in
okay.
that's a whole nother,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so formative in nature. Oh, darlings, okay.
Well,
Sorry. And so there was discussion. Can we put forward a few ideas about what we understand to be formative so that we can have a working definition that is not perfect for this group?
I would say yes.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Okay, so agreeing to imperfection.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, and just with that in mind, I would just say that for the purposes of the TPA in terms of how it's saying it's formative, using it as a snapshot of a beginning teacher, knowing that this is the beginning and knowing that there is a professional arc of learning that is still happening and that the assessment is also designed to be the basis for the individualized induction program.
Mhm.
So I think if we keep it in that context, I think we can move forward.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
then when you start to think about formative in and of itself, or something, we all know.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the things, I'll just say this. So I feel like when I started hitting my stride as a teacher, I realized the best thing I could do is create formative assessments and give feedback in a quick, timely manner to students. And I would see students grow because then at the point you're differentiating based off the student's level of need, right? And giving them something in their zone of proximal development of like, this is what will help you to grow in this moment. The interesting thing about that is I recognize that IDP, ILP, right? Like I'm two different terms, BITSA or induction, sorry, versus intern, is up to the candidate to provide to induction, and I cannot provide it to induction. So induction may or may not have a snapshot because that would violate FERPA.
Correct.
And so it becomes this interesting dichotomy of if we're really being formative and working with a student on what they need, and don't get me wrong, theoretically, they're making an ID, they do make an IDP with us, but theoretically it's continuing into induction as it's written. Like, if you want this person who knows the student and what they need the most, it would be the program in that point that would have a chance to work on building those skills. I would say the coach, the person who's at the school site working with that person day to day, would be the faculty members, what a great opportunity to differentiate based off the student's level. And so to me, when I hear formative in nature in an ideal stance, that would be my target, because that is where you're going to see the growth happen. But like, I think that's what the conversation was saying yesterday is I think different programs
Do it differently.
well, and the problem is you might have a submission in March, which means you're not getting scores until May, and then what, right?
Yeah.
And there's just the idea that it's at the very end.
Yeah, and you can't go back
Go back and
in the classroom.
you'd
right?
almost, it would almost be very helpful for it to be designed so that it was iterative throughout your entire student teaching.
That's all I mean.
experience,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
You're right, though. People do the induction thing differently. Like for our candidates, they have that, the induction plan. It's based off of obviously the TPEs and whatnot.
Mhm.
But it's the coach and the candidate and the mentor teacher. And the three of them do that discussion and fill out that form,
Right.
which makes sense.
Yeah.
Because those are the people that know that's candidate best, right?
So I'm loving this conversation. It's this, I'm like chomping at the bit here because what I have wished we had in California for such a long time is a continuum of teaching from early pre-service, on up to nationally board certified teachers, like so many of you are in this room. So what we currently have is the continuum of teaching for the CSTPs, where we have, so it's not just, I think there is I know there is a difference between standards and what standards say. Standards describe practice, they describe what you should be seeing in practice, et cetera. But the continuum is like a rubric. It will describe practice at different levels of sophistication. And one problem I think we've had in California is we have sort of a different continuum in pre-service, and then we have a different continuum in service. And if it was continuous, as Kathy was saying, this arc of, I don't know which I heard arc. So it was the sort of the arc of practice from, throughout your career. If we had a common arc that we could use, common rubrics, and maybe it's just however many levels, it's like if you reach this level, by the time you go into your first year of teaching, this is where you need to be.
I love that. I will also say, so 10 minutes left, just so you know. So I will also just kind of throw in, and I'm sorry, I don't want to hog, so I'm going to stop talking after this. But the rubrics, thank you, please do. The rubrics for like TPA. So I think about best practices. And again, I recognize this formative in nature. If I gave a student a rubric that was 9 pages long, it could be without any other feedback, right? Like with nothing else, because as a program, I can ask questions. My folks can generate questions and thinking, but we can't provide the targeted feedback. And so it becomes really interesting because I do feel like some of our candidates, it doesn't feel the program can chunk it. Different programs may or may not. Yeah. And so it may or may not be chunked based off the rubric, right? It may or may not. And so that's 100%, you're right, Tina, on what you just said. That continuum would be so helpful, especially with like an idea, and I don't want to get into programs having curriculum thrust on them, although I also recognize in teaching, there is such a thing as curriculum within a classroom, right? And so being able to chunk and kind of spread out those ideas and not have a 9-page rubric for candidates to figure out what am I doing well and what am I not, and having something a little more simplified. I realize we're talking about concept themes, but could be super helpful. You know what I mean? And to me, that's something for formative. It feels like we're hurting people in understanding what they're doing well or not by overloading them. Brand new folks, like we wouldn't start a classroom with here's 18 pages of rubrics, kids. Figure out like how you can grow, right? Like that's not what I would do with students. I know we're dealing with adults, but
But still though, the work of teaching, right? If we're talking about the authentic work of teaching, shouldn't that apply to our candidates who are taking this assessment as well? And
Yeah.
the truth of the matter is, it should be this iterative arc over your professional career because that is authentic. We all know we don't just come out of the gate being super. We know that there are certain benchmarks we need to, things like, yes, you should know how to make a lesson plan that is associated with some standards, right? You should know how to communicate and break it down, right? Those things you can measure, right? And so I'm wondering if somehow maybe the TPAs have been a little bit too ambitious. And in doing so, trying to be everything,
Right.
have really made it much more difficult than it needs to be.
I would like to echo that because I'm sitting here also thinking I've always struggled with this idea of formative with the TPA. I think we all have, just based on this conversation in the room, and some pretty well agreed upon understandings of what we mean by, not just what we mean by formative, but what the world means by formative in classrooms with kids and teaching. But is that what the TPA can and should be doing? I don't know if it can do all of that.
Exactly.
So I'd like to point out that with the time we have remaining, which it can be flexible, that we've had a really good conversation about formative as in the moment, but not necessarily connecting well, which might relate to our next steps and questions.
Mhm.
And we have kind of started transitioning to our definition of reasonable.
Mhm.
And so reasonable might be the opposite of bureaucratic, right? And reasonable as a non-example, which isn't always the most helpful thing, but reasonable might be something that's more localized and based on best practice. This is what I heard Ben say, for programs that are doing it well. And so other aspects of reasonable, yeah.
Yeah, I think, in the context, reasonable in the wide range of classrooms. And I think that also we kind of cover this when we talked about authentic.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And, valid. I think all of these things, you made a really good point. If we cover some of these other things, valid's kind of a natural byproduct, right? Because again, reasonable in that candidates are not at a disservice if they don't have a certain type of classroom and a certain type of mentor teacher. Or further, a certain program, right?
Yeah, well said.
Because they're not all created equal. And so how do you get that authenticity if you don't have some base level of equity, right? So that's what I think of when I hear reasonable.
I would like to echo what was said earlier about the professional arc of learning that Kathy mentioned. I think that's what we were getting at. I was looking at my notes. And I feel like that's what would be reasonable. I have this conversation, I feel like every spring with my student teachers, my pre-service teachers, and I'm like, but you're a beginning educator. I don't think anyone would require you to do this type of level that you are maybe conceptualizing in your head based on this rubric, based on the stress. I'm like, it has to be reasonable at the beginning of the continuum, right? Like, and we can, I think that that's reasonable for us to ask that we have educators that can do A, B, and C. Starting out in the classroom, because in the classroom and the context and where you teach and the students will then fulfill the rest of the needs as you go there. I don't know if that makes sense for us to like focus on basics with the understanding that we see the potential for growth, which is super difficult to assess, but I don't think it's difficult to envision.
Right.
I can envision a pre-service teacher growing in certain aspects, but I think I mentioned yesterday how like TPA should be a part of a holistic performance where we do see the inequities in guiding teachers, in programs, but we have to still figure out the basics of the start,
And operationalizing that would be complex and insane.
Yeah.
I mean, to try and operationalize how somebody would assess that or how you would train assessors to assess, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
In terms of like, I guess, well, I like the idea of chunking. I think, Ben, you might have mentioned chunking. I think, and Tina, you were saying like at the beginning, there are some basics that you need to know how to plan, whatever. And I just think that maybe some suggestions could, revolve around breaking things up a little bit.
Yes.
Let's break
Yes.
it up a little bit.
Throughout the course of the year.
Exactly. Let's break it up.
The lesson plan does not need to be, right?
Yeah. And, and it won't be so high stakes because I think that's also an issue.
And that would be embedded in program very
Right,
easily at that
exactly,
point.
exactly.
All right, 3-minute warning.
Yeah, I'm gonna make a note for that for the identify sources.
Mhm.
And I'd like to circle back to this idea, because now we're like very lovely transitioning from reasonable to appropriate. And so what I heard you say, Natalia, is that like we can and should expect early career educators to execute specific skills, right? And we know, and my question for part C is, like, what are the most effective skills that we know will actually sustain them in their career? And are those actually being assessed? Right. So the research has been done. And what are the most important skills for students to have in classrooms, and are those being assessed? Right. And so we know that they can execute those specific skills. I think that is completely reasonable. But then kind of now helping us maybe move towards appropriate, is appropriate being able to do the choreography with help? Is appropriate doing it well? There's a difference. I can dance, I cannot dance well, right? Or is it like, should it be a spectrum, understanding that we don't want everyone to aim for here, and some educators will want to aim for here, but there needs to be a bar. And so what would be, I guess, what is our definition of appropriate?
I'd love to hear a little from Tina too. She
Yeah.
hasn't said much recently. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to call you out unless.
Thank you. No, I'll circle back to reasonable in just a second, but I think this is just such a valuable conversation about the appropriate, especially appropriate doing the work with help. I remember being in a meeting with Lee Schulman, and if you know who Lee is, he was a very renowned Stanford professor. Does everybody know who Lee Schulman is or had? But he's done a lot of work with assessments. And when in the very beginning, when we were talking about performance assessments, he was really arguing for learning how to teach is learning how to teach. And just like learning how to write a dissertation, you have mentors who are constantly helping you and providing you with feedback along the way. And it is a result of that process that you are doing the work better. And eventually you're going to do the work on your own. But to what extent does it matter the help that they're getting? I don't know. I guess I'm getting off a little bit on this, but what is appropriate in terms of we've always had that struggle with this TPA. All right, some programs are providing a lot more support and help than others are, and that's not we've heard that a lot, right?
Yeah, you've got the teaching to the test arguments and whatnot.
Yeah.
Which, to me, in terms of, this performance assessment, if it's supposed to be truly something that starts somebody on their journey, it's helpful. I think any bit of feedback, I think is helpful. I think, Tina, you said exactly. It's like, what sense does it make to not have that be part of the process? Because again, we go back to authentic and organic.
Right.
What is the work of teaching is constant reflection, constant
Adjustment,
all
reflection,
day.
adjustment.
And so how unreasonable is it that we would expect, boom?
I will say this, that from my experience with pre-service teachers from various institutions, the ones where their program is embedding the TPA and is kind of pushing them through it, even mechanically, when they're done, both of us in that program, we don't have that stress anymore of TPA. And so now I can focus my first year on my first year. And so I feel like there is some validation there to say like it's needs to be embedded, and we'll get to that later, but there is something to be said about the difference of programming that is done at the institution, which I don't have a lot of access to, but and that helps students pre-service students kind of say, okay, that is off my list now, I can focus on my teaching and then the induction program and what comes next. So there is some,
I think that does go to appropriateness, like what you're talking about right now, right? And I know we got to move and transition, but It's also interesting with different students in different placements.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah,
Because
could
all
I-
of a sudden their time might be focused on the needs of their students instead of an assessment, as I would think it should be.
Right.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like I would have prioritized my work that type of way myself.
Right.
And it could be overwhelming for someone who's like an intern
Right.
versus a student teacher, where a student teacher, you might have time in a classroom with the person in front of you teaching to like start knocking it out and then have them check out what you did. But an intern's got the lesson planning, the grading, and the IEPs, the SSTs. So they're not getting home until like 6, and then they're grading or lesson planning, and then the TPAs after that. You know what I mean? And it creates like a disparity. Like we see the disparity. There are programs where have both student teachers and internship, same
Right.
faculty, same, and no matter what, the interns always score less well. And I might be jumping ahead, but appropriateness to me does come to mind with that.
Well, and how appropriate is it to expect someone, of the typical age of a student teacher to have the type of agency, like you were saying before, in terms of, making their decisions and, pushing back when they need to push back and, that sort of thing. They don't necessarily have that agency yet.
Yeah.
And
Right.
so, not being able to, I guess when we talk about maturity levels as well, how appropriate is it for this high stakes of an exam or assessment to do what it is trying to do?
Mhm.
You know what I mean?
I would just, these things bring me back to the question about reasonable and appropriate, I think are very well combined.
Agreed.
But I think one of the things that you all are also talking about is reasonable to and appropriate for different program structures. So you have candidates who are interns, you have candidates who are doing some of their work online in different places from where their university supervisors are. You have a lot of different program structures. And I think one of the questions we might have is what are those different structures to be, so that we all have an understanding of what those contexts might be to ensure that we're making recommendations for the reasonableness and appropriateness of the assessment.
Thank you so much for helping us transition into identifying questions. That was so
Very clever.
And so,
Time has started.
yeah, and so as we think about the kinds of programs, another question that was surfaced earlier that I'd like to come back to and ask to have on the minutes is also, Ben, you brought up scores by program.
Mhm.
Right, and so can we really look into how students are scoring differently by program, if students are scoring differently by program, and how that might impact how we understand the work that we do to envision a better situation for educators and quite frankly, which we haven't mentioned yet, the students who are sitting in front of them. Because if you have nieces and nephews or children or, brothers and sisters who are in public schools, is it a perfect world if they're in with an intern
Right.
or a student teacher? And right. Right. It should be. And if we could remove barriers to help students have better experiences, like ultimately that would be the goal. So I think my question two then would be, if we are looking at localized best practices, right? What are the most successful programs with the highest pass rates? What is that looking like? Like, do we have any kind of large overviews of what
I
that
would
is?
add to that, like, I would really like to know the best practices in terms of programs that are doing a great job embedding the TPA in their passage rate. And I would add the percentage of their alumni who are continuing in education. Because that's ultimately the goal, right? It's not just to get them to pass the TPA, hopefully, right? It's to envision the continuum that they are staying in the classroom past the, whatever marks it is for different areas, because I know, urban centers have a different need than like our rural communities. And so whatever that mark is, or whatever the number is, are they staying past that 5 years, 3 years, or so on and so forth.
And
And do they feel effective?
And do they feel
Yeah,
effective?
that
But,
makes
and I would even say that becomes a really hard metric to pull.
Yeah.
Because you can look at active credentials very, very easily. I know a lot of people with an active credential who are no longer in a classroom
Right.
that don't want it to deactivate. And so all of a sudden, I don't know who, when we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, I imagine,
That's
across
a
the state.
whole nother thing because, you know, even getting the information to be able to email your candidates after they're out of your program,
Yeah.
you run into a lot of the, you know, the legal issues in California, you know, collecting everybody's
Yeah, yeah.
information. So
Right.
that's a tough one.
Yeah.
But it's so, but Talia, that is like key, I think, honestly. I think it's very
I
critical.
think so too. The data that we need is really key. Cradle to career is
Yeah.
trying
Exactly.
to develop this. CTC is trying to develop this.
Yeah.
I was a part of a research center where we could finally track candidates from pre-service to in service, but it's not a perfect system yet. And you're right, we need that. We absolutely need that.
So I guess I'm wondering then, and I'm not sure because I'm not an administrator, if there's metrics for school districts, because I know school districts have to keep metrics of how many teachers are credentialed.
Mhm.
But if school districts are keeping metrics of how many early career teachers, because we have like their induction, we know who's induction,
Yeah.
right? So we can kind of have the metric of who's in induction in school districts because they do need to clear. And typically they're doing it through a private or through a public induction program, or depending on what the situation is in a particular community. If we could see data from that, and then I think if we had the induction data, we would kind of understand where they are, right? And then maybe if we see that they're no longer working in those schools, I mean, that would be really tedious to figure out. I would also be curious. I feel like it's known that early career teachers end up in some of the highest need schools with some of the highest need students. So they're doing the toughest job with the least amount of mentors and supports.
Mhm.
And in LA County, I know that to be true. And so I'm wondering, as we think about the data that we receive, if it's ever disaggregated by like where the placements are and how successful they are after with sustaining in the career. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because that might change our definitions of reasonable and appropriate. Because we're saying, well, this is what you can do with a mentor, and this is what you can do with a support system. And but now you are in a school where you're the department chair as a first year teacher. You know, because there's no one else, because you're all first year
Right,
teachers.
right.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if that would change and so my question is, do we change our definition of reasonable and appropriate once we look at the realities of actual placement of teachers?
Probably.
Yes, I would think so. I mean, I guess because that does kind of goes to, again, like you were saying, the reasonableness of it. Because again, you know, if we're charged or trying to have candidates come out that can teach all children, then that's a very wide variety of placements and issues.
Right.
Okay, yes, absolutely.
Exactly. And then we can also think about, I think Talia, is that how you pronounce your
Yeah.
name?
Yes.
Sorry, because I couldn't hear at the very beginning. Talia, what you were also, I think you were saying about, or one of you saying, sorry, about different contexts. Staying in the classroom. Are you in an urban setting? Are you in a rural setting? Are you prepared for those settings too? And are you staying there? So there's, we credential teachers to teach in the entire state of California, but there's still there are other considerations out there with respect to programs will also prepare candidates for their areas. You know, some are very specific to the communities and students that they serve. And how is our performance assessment, what's the word I'm trying to responsive to the contexts and sometimes the specializations that candidates need for those contexts.
I was gonna say the same thing.
Yeah, is
Okay.
there space for that? Is it built into this assessment?
Mhm.
To what extent, I should say, because it has been tried. I
I
mean,
think that was a little bit of the conversation yesterday was the idea of like the local assessing, right? Like we need to have a more localized assessment because the needs are very different. And from what I understand is most people are gonna choose an institution to do their pre-service work in the location that they're envisioning beginning their career and then clearing their credential, which is, I don't know the data on that, but I'm assuming most of us did that. We went to an institution based on where we were going to live or were living at the moment to then begin our careers. And if that institution did a great job of preparing us for the context of our teaching, then there you go. But there has to be a conversation about the local assessing. And I think, I don't know who mentioned the whole also having educators assess or be a part of the assessment process, which is a whole different whole conversation, but yeah, I think it was.
that's really a good point though, because I'm wondering what the data is on how, when you hire an assessor, where are they? And is there any accounting for, okay, this candidate is in, LA County, is the assessor in LA County? Right? I mean, I don't know if the assessment program, I don't know if the assessors do that. I don't know if they do that at all in terms of matching that up, because that would be something that's very valuable. I don't know.
Right, right.
And I'm not supposed to be
Talk, but it's really fun to watch your face.
and I have a poker face. Hi, Commissioner Sloan, it's Erin Sullivan. I'm in the room. as
Oh,
staff.
hi, Erin.
I'm supposed to be very quiet, but I.
Yeah, she's doing great.
But I can feel her
I
reaction.
don't have a poker face.
Feel her.
Literally made me laugh.
I can feel it.
And
I-
Erin, I'm not a commissioner anymore, Erin.
Sorry, that you will always be.
Sorry, Kathleen. go
Commissioner
ahead.
Emeritus.
It's so funny. I think that is really, so I want to honor what you just said, but I laughed and now I'm lost.
Sorry.
And
He said is the assessor matched based on the.
okay,
Based on
right,
like-
so
They can consider it. I mean,
think that
Consideration.
that really echoes back. Thank you so much for taking good notes. The initial issue of validity that we kind of tabled in terms of if all of these things are present, most likely it is valid. Because I'm imagining that there's a tension between having people who are too close to the actual person being assessed to objectively assess them.
there's that.
And the tension of having people who are engaged in the community and work and practice, who are best understanding what should be done in that particular classroom, in that particular space, right? And especially as, and so I think my final question has a little bit to do with the makeup of the assessors. Are they reflective of the teaching population we have? Are they reflective of the teaching population we would like to have? And are they local, like you asked, to the particular setting? Because I think those are important questions to ask. And are they still human, I suppose, is my last. Right, because we need to bake in some humanity to all of this, you guys. Otherwise,
Right.
it's a little scary because it will be very cost effective not to have humans do any of this
Mhm.
anymore. And there's a lot of implications there that are both time saving and remove bias, but also are terrifying and problematic. We can talk about that some other time. Are we ready to kind of round out questions and ask for sources? And then we can always like circle back and add last little things. So do we have 15 minutes to identify sources we'd like to have?
Or can I propose something real quick?
Please.
I'm gonna go through, I've been taking copious notes on pretty much everything anyone said. I know that's probably not my role, but I bolded and underlined the things that stood out, so I just want to make sure I'm capturing things well for the group.
Yeah.
Okay, so for authentic, we have organic, flexible, and we have needs a lesson plan was something Tina called out. Reflective and honest. It should not feel like a checklist, instead be treated as a skill in the classroom. and that I think those are the things I had bolded. Is there anything missing for authentic?
We said not
you-
perfect, but that's okay.
Have honest in there?
Yeah, honest.
Honest is in there, yeah.
Okay, sorry. I
Reflective.
think you got it.
Cool. And then for formative in nature, I just want to make sure, I'm sorry, I don't mean to take too much time with this. But we have basically continuum of like standards for people understanding the arc, right? And we have chunked. Those are the things that I have written down. Is there anything for formative that needs to be taken?
Iterative process.
Thank you.
And something that you kept saying, Ben, timely feedback.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
That is 100, to me, that is the most
Yeah.
important. If it's about growing, that's the most important, right? For reasonable, I have opposite of bureaucratic. Localized, based on best practice, wide range of classrooms, and works for all classrooms, right? So like all classrooms and all students is basically what I have written down for reasonable.
Can I add specific?
Yes.
And I think also reasonable for different preparation program structures.
Thank you. Yes, that was something. I appreciate you saying that. I think some of my reasonable ended up in appropriateness because we were kind of bouncing back and forth. Because under appropriateness for a beginning teacher, I have that, what she just called out. That belongs in reasonable, so you're 100% right to call that out. What should we, can we and should we expect teachers to implement certain skills? Should it be with help, right? And what is the level of help appropriate? Continuous cycle of learning and improvement, meaning adjust on reflection, right? Like adjusting and reflecting. Needs to be embedded was called out. And then after that, I went to questions. So am I missing anything for appropriate for beginning teacher?
You got it.
Cool. Questions we have, one question might be, what are the different structures to ensure we're making recommendations for the reasonableness and appropriateness of the assessment? What are the most successful programs? What do they look like? What are the best practices for programs scoring well the TPA and the passage? What are I wrote that badly, I'll fix it. What is the percentage of the alumni who continue in education? What is the percentage of alumni who feel effective that continued in education? Do school districts have metrics of how many early career teachers continue in through like induction? Can we see data on that? Can we get data on where the field placements are and how effective they are in sustaining the growth of the career? If it is a bunch of first-year teachers on one campus, there's less expertise to grow from. So with the urban and the rural setting, there's a bunch of implications with that. And I put a question mark at the end, so I don't know if that should be
Maybe
that.
that would be like a source.
Yeah,
instead.
well, and then it says, are they staying there, is what it was. Programs will prepare them for students in our area. How are performance assessments responsive to the context and specialization for the people within those contexts? Is the assessor matched based on area, and are they reflective of the population we have or would like to have within that region? Are they local to the particular setting? Are they human? Am I missing any questions?
I think you
Cool,
got
I'm
it.
sorry, I didn't mean to hijack. I just want to make sure.
Tina had a thought and then we paused.
I'm sorry, Tina, did I miss something?
Oh, sorry. Oh, it was only back up and appropriate. Somebody had said something that I thought was key, and that was the agency of student teachers in a classroom. It always is an issue. You're in somebody else's classroom, and I always just remember seeing that difficulty in trying to implement something in somebody else's classroom when you're a student teacher.
Thank you, I have that added.
I have a question. I don't know if this is a question, but if we're moving into resources, it could be a resource question.
Yeah.
Okay, if we can move there. One of the things I'm very curious to understand better, and it relates to the formative nature of the assessments, is I want to know more about other high stakes performance assessments used in education that are formative in nature. And if we had resources around this, I think it would be very helpful I've seen some used in TK-12 education, particularly in high school, even for college admissions. What do those look like? What do they do? There are also assessments used in teacher preparation programs that are formative in nature, but are high stakes for the programs. What do they look like? Could we get more information on what a formative standardized assessment looks like?
You talking about, Tina, in California or nationally?
Anywhere.
Anywhere, okay.
So
I have started.
the 15-minute, okay, yeah. So I think that would be a helpful source to help us support deliberation. And thinking about other helpful sources to support deliberation, I know we've kind of started that. Looking back at our questions, what do we need to help us answer the questions?
Data. We definitely need a lot of data from the testing services in terms of, who the assessors are, I think. I think that's kind of important. I think we don't talk about that enough, possibly. I don't know. I mean, like, is there a match, I guess, in other words? I mean, I know that assessors have bias training, they have, calibration and that sort of thing, but I'm not sure how, and like you say, I mean, are they human? I mean.
The fact that we can't answer their question is. There he is.
Even what are the requirements or who's eligible to become an assessor? Because I'm an assessor for a few different other assessments I think that Tina was mentioning for other high stakes. But for this one, there's always a eligibility, right? So like you have to do X, Y, and Z. So it might not just be that 10-year, 15-year veteran teacher who can become an assessor.
Right.
Because they don't meet the requirements that they're asking for,
So this is something that's more selfish and not driven by this conversation, but I'd be curious to get data on how many error codes per year are that cause some resubmissions because
That speaks to the bureaucracy of
Yes.
the reasonable.
Right,
well, and also because they're talking about like programs supporting candidates for free. I'm okay with that. We already do that.
right.
But to me, the problem then becomes the amount of times I've contacted over someone misclicked a credential
Right.
and they pass, but they have to resubmit and spend $200 and spend 4 more hours adjusting what they already or finding what they already had to submit under a different credential, even though they passed and met the standards. Like I've seen things like that. I've seen things like people failed for ELL standards because they said they didn't have EL students, but then they talked about language proficiencies at another point. So they get error coded out, even if the submission is strong, because you might have an ELL student based off the data. And I've called the folks needed to happen, been told they had to resubmit. So like I've had people go on extensions and have to spend thousands of dollars in terms of like, they need a coach and a mentor to be on extension. They need to retake and redo this TPA now. And all of a sudden, the person is so furious and rightfully so. And these are all from error codes that it's an interesting dynamic if a company is error coding someone and unreasonable to change or work with. That's the opposite of UDL, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know, these are all anecdotal. I have no data on this. But I don't know if other programs are experiencing this, but I've had 3 in the last month of people who passed, or may have passed, but were error coded out and had to resubmit. And there's no other way of doing it over things like a misclick on credential, or they think there's an EL student when the person claims there's not an EL student, or things like that. And it's creating I can understand some of the frustration some candidates have on error codes based off of that because it becomes a checklist, which is what we talked about before. So like selfishly, I do want to know things about that.
No, that's actually really, it speaks to the validity and the reasonableness.
Yes.
Yeah.
It totally speaks to that.
Right.
Then add, I would like, maybe opening a can of worms. I would like the most recent audits that have been done by outside auditors of the program and how, right? And then when they go, there isn't.
What do you mean by
Right,
audit?
so has it been audited, especially things that are being performed by like Pearson, which is clearly not CTC, that's like an outside company.
Yeah.
has there ever been an audit of their, right, like validity of, you know, like how effective like the actual structure and program is? Have we like checked to make sure it's aligned, right? And so has there ever been any oversight to ensure that from the first day they started to now, 10 or 15 years later, that things are still tight and squeaky and true? And if not, like what other gatekeeping processes are there to make sure that things are consistently aligned? And so if not an audit, then going back to my, like, then it would need to be a question, like, what standards are there for consistency, right? And, because these seem like errors that should have been avoided
Right.
by just a human
Yeah,
Right.
standing back and going, no,
Yes.
this should not be part of the handbook and process,
Right.
right? There should be a handbook.
yes.
Is there a handbook? I want the
There is.
handbook.
There is.
There is.
I want
And-
the handbook.
and
I'm a
it's-
high school English teacher. I don't have the
Well,
handbook.
the misclick on the
Yeah.
credential is something like as a
Yeah.
program we should
Yeah.
catch, but we get the reports once a month, so it might be too late to
Too late
catch
to
it
catch it.
by the time they
Oh,
submit it.
Correct.
there you go.
So the other thing I will say, I think there was a recent outside audit, if I'm not mistaken. I thought in Meredith Fellows conference that I attended, that there was an outside assessment on the TPA that came up with like correlations and different things. So I think there's some
Okay.
public information on it. I may not be the best person to speak on it, but I do think there is some public information that we might be able to dissect during our time together.
Oh, okay.
That's good. That's a
There-
good idea.
That is the thing I want. Thank you.
There was an analysis done of the 3 different assessments used in California to understand the consistency across them and how they are aligned. So there is that, but I think there's also, then there are standards for programs that require the programs to meet implementation consistently, and they have to show that they do that through accreditation. But then I think, Kathleen, what you were talking about is that the testing companies, this issue of the error codes, are they audited in some way so that we're ensuring that they're doing their work well, that are these error codes just continuing unbidden and we don't know why? Or is there some mechanism for catching that? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes.
And so I don't have an answer to that. I don't know if there is.
Right, that's what we want to know.
Hold on, timekeeper, sorry.
Oh,
You're doing-
7
you're good,
minutes?
Becca.
You're doing
Seven
great.
minutes.
I have one other resource I would like to propose that we have for our group, and that comes back to the term validity. And I think it would be very helpful if we had a mini lesson on what psychometricians mean by validity, because there's context validity, content validity, predictability, there's validity of the instrument itself, there's validity of applying it to a context. I think going back to what somebody said when we were in the general session, having a very good common understanding of that really loaded term would be super important for us. And it relates also to reliability. People mix up those two as well, often validity
Yes.
and reliability. So if we had a little mini lesson by somebody on that would be helpful. I
Agreed.
think.
Oh, we did talk, candidate, information in terms of their experience with the assessment, some type of feedback on there. When we had some from the pilot that was just done, and I imagine they're gonna do the same kind of thing after the field test, but on an ongoing basis, does that happen? Does that happen? I mean, it happens when you're formulating and designing the assessment, but where is that information, for later, Because I would think that should be something that we kind of collect information on an ongoing basis. We should know how candidates, because again, we can also look at what a candidate's experience is over here versus over there, program, also understanding like the differences between what type of program you went through. I think that type of, candidate survey data, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
My question would be like, is that, it's not embedded in the actual submission of the TPA, and why is it not? Is that not a part of it? Should probably authentically be a part of the. I think it's inherent in the reflective part of the TPA, but I don't think candidates can differentiate between like me being reflective about and me getting a question specifically about my experience, my feelings towards
This assessment.
this assessment. That's usually done at the programmatic level, as opposed to like embedding that into the TPA itself as like a self-reflection at the end or.
'Cause I know like the CTC has a completer survey, but I think the question is, like something to the effect of, did your program prepare you for the TPA or something like that?
Yes.
I don't think it got into the nitty gritty of your actual experience with this TPA, you know?
Yeah, and I don't know if that belongs with CTC or
Oh,
if that
right.
belongs with a TPA. I just.
Or whoever, yeah.
Yeah.
I also.
Yeah. I was doing my wait time thing. So we're gonna let people breathe. What do you think, Ben?
Well, I was just gonna say, I was thinking about, we talked about beginning teachers. And there's gotta be, there's a ton of research on beginning teachers, like I know it exists and it's all over the place. Part of me wonders what the research calls out as like the most important or identifiable traits or skills or however you wanna frame it, right? For beginning teachers to be successful in the classroom. And then like the correlation between that and like our measurements. And then the second thing I was thinking was we've talked about things in the United States, and I recognize we're very diverse across like our landscape and may not have things in common with other countries. But I'd also be curious to look outside the United States, like Finland or like some of the other countries that have very strong teacher prep or educational based systems. I would also be curious to know what sort of systems they use. New York, credentialing. They have to get a master's degree to get a credential, right? So there's different systems that happen. I'm not proposing but just having some of the information about, like you said, we talked about formative assessments, but like I'm very curious to know the places doing things well outside of assessment as well. And I know our focus is assessment, but is it the assessment that they are using that creates the impact? Or are there other things they're doing to support beginning teachers? Do you see what I'm saying?
Right.
And I realize that's outside of our scope a little bit, but to me, that is part of the question.
I think, honestly, I'm not so sure it's outside the scope in it, because you make a really good point, because again, when we're talking about authentic and reasonable and all those things, is the preparation that's happening within a system and context, you know, is it directly related, and is the assessment matched up reasonably? So, you know, and looking at other systems and seeing how those two things can be connected, because like you say, you know, just an accounting for different political systems and different societal
Yeah,
norms, so
right.
on and so forth.
Right.
But again, are those things all aligned? Because, you know, you could look at us here in America and see that there's some misalignment going on. You know what I mean?
I think it's reasonable.
I think it's reasonable.
Actionable to ask for.
Yeah.
I think it's completely reasonable.
I think it totally makes sense, Ben. And I think it's within our scope. Ish.
He said we could do what we want. We did not add anything to like the list, because this was a meaty list. And so before we transition, and what I'd like to like kind of preface this, they gave us 10 minutes. We can take a bio break if we need it, and if we need to stretch and move our bodies, because we were not evolved to sit here like we absolutely can. We did not talk about other concept related to charge of the work group as its own separate function within focus area 1. So how about like a last call? Is there anything else we missed that it's burning? We can also come back to it too if we think of it while we're filling our waters. Was there any other concepts related to the charge that anyone wanted to add in? I'd like to put forward that you guys really talked about classroom settings across the state, even though it wasn't emphasized, you really built it in, and I appreciate that. We do have 10 minutes for transitioning to the next focus
I
area.
heard there was Wi-Fi issues with the drone.
I think
Not anymore, it's fixed.
No,
Wait, I'm sorry.
there are, because we put everybody on hotspot.
Hardline,
So
okay.
the Millstock Wi-Fi is not there. Emerjock can help.
I do not know things about the Wi-Fi. How much of a break do you want? Because I know we're right in time here. Do you guys want 10? Do you need 5? How do we want to do?
The note says that we'll return at 11:50 and then we'll discuss additional time if needed. So I think we could start the second week after our break and then whatever time we flow into. So
Awesome.
I would think 10 if that's
Yeah,
possible.
ooh, you were humans and we were built for these chairs.
Never.
So, the 10-minute bio group would have us return at 07. Tina, does that work for you as well? And stakeholders, we have a 10-minute break built in here.
Oh, wait.
It's 11.
11:04 right now.
4,
So
okay,
11:14.
14.
Yeah.
Look at me.
Something's going on with the screen there.
Yeah.
Okay, so stakeholders, just to be transparent, we will be taking a 10-minute break to refill waters and use restroom and things like that. We encourage you to do so as well. And we will return to pick up with round 2 focus area 2.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Virtually. Oh, okay.
Tina, I think we'll get started in just a moment. And members of the public, we're back. So I just want to like completely affirm what everyone's been saying about how wonderful everyone here is. You guys are amazing. No norm enforcement required. So thank you just for spending a really like such an interesting hour. You guys, that was so interesting. And so I know they're on their edges of their seats at home. So, and as we transition to focus area 2, now that you've had a second to think and breathe, is there anything we missed for focus area 1? Yeah, it's not.
I think we got what we can get.
Okay. It's not like we're like
We're not tied.
putting it in concrete, you know, so I think if we need to go back, we can. Or if anything from focus area 2 kind of surfaces something for 1. I think I'm open to that. So I'm proposing for focus area 2, given the time that that's clock is wrong. Okay.
Yes.
Given the time that we have 20, 30, 40, 50. We have 34 minutes, which maybe isn't enough time to do this full cycle. It's not enough time to do a full cycle of brainstorming, discussing, and identifying questions and sources. What if we try to do the best we can to get through brainstorming and discussing? If we do end up moving quickly and can get to identifying questions, I'm open to that, absolutely. But I want to make sure we are authentic selves and take the time that we need. And so for the first 15 minutes, brainstorming possible attributes of the focus area concepts, which are embedding the assessments into coursework and clinical work, avoiding duplicative work alternatives, and to the maximum feasible extent, each performance assessment should be ongoing and blended into the teacher prep program. A question. Yes. I know, but would anyone like to start thinking about attributes? And maybe we'll just start with A, if that's okay. Embedding assessments into coursework and clinical work. I guess
When I think about it, if it were truly to be embedded, the assessment, that is, because, the concepts may be embedded, or at least that's, what program standards are supposed to help you do. The assessment, I think, would need to be done over a longer period of time. It needs to be, again, when we talk about in guided practice, it should be chunked out and parsed out over that experience, the whole experience. I think when you put something at the end and make it a licensure requirement, that absolutely negates the whole idea of the iterative process and the way it's supposed to be formative in terms of, giving that feedback, because again, timely feedback, Ben, like you're saying, you're not getting timely feedback. And that's what makes it so high stakes, and I think that's contrary to what the intent should be in terms of helping a candidate truly be ready for a classroom. Because, we're getting you ready for the classroom. We should understand, and the assessment should understand, that a beginning teacher is just that.
I would echo that the programs that I've seen that do a great job, not only do they embed it, they make it clear. So I know exactly which standard and part of the standard I'm addressing when I'm doing this lesson plan, when I'm doing this coursework. And so it's not only embedded, but it's clear to the candidate in what ways you're meeting those specific standards, which is what we would ask of ourselves as educators with our students, right? Like, how are we making it clear for them to understand how everything in one way or another relates to the
I'd just like to add to that, because I think this is right now where the formative process comes in with the assessment. I think when we think about formative, it's not necessarily the measure itself, but it is the process. And the formative process is often what the faculty and mentors are doing to help prepare the candidate ultimately to demonstrate their learning in the assessment context. But it is that process over an extended period of time, and how programs choose to provide those experiences that prepare their candidates.
I feel like a lot of programs, and I don't have quantitative data to back this up, right? But create things that streamline towards the assessment. Great example, like I'll talk personally, but I've seen this with a bunch of programs. Lesson plan templates that might have a lot to do with how the TPA is and gives candidates opportunities to practice without it being a TPA lesson plan template, that the exact skills and very similar worded questions on, right? Like with feedback over time. And so they start embedding things. But the thing that you kind of spoke about, Kathy, was like the assessment being embedded is different than the skills being embedded. And what we're talking about is the difference between like a curriculum and an assessment, right? And it's just so interesting to me because I think that if we were really looking at, it's why I asked about purpose of the assessment yesterday. I understand what the purpose of the TPA is, right? But like if we were really looking at growing teachers, or are we looking at making sure they hit a benchmark? Or are we looking at, because there's so many different ways you can go. Growing teachers might be coaches where every single coaching feedback could be part of an assessment cycle. It could be chunked learning how to do lessons throughout the course of a year, and all of a sudden that becomes like an assessment, formative check-ins, right? Or are we talking about, for lack of a better term, gatekeeper? And those are two very different things. So when I'm talking about like purpose of assessment, that's what's going on in my mind, is like, what is it we're looking at?
Right, because I guess part of that is also, the terms and what the purpose of the assessment is in terms of making sure that programs are equitable in terms of how we prepare candidates. I mean, are candidates getting similar experiences? Right?
I agree.
I mean,
No,
what is our-
definitely not.
you
We
know,
already know the answer is
Well,
no.
that's the answer, we know the answer, but
Right?
again, the purpose, what is the purpose?
Right.
Honestly, because again, if you're trying to assess how well a program is preparing somebody, or like you said,
Right.
gatekeeper, right?
Well, and
'Cause
like
those are different things. They're very different.
transparently, we do not teach to the test. We do not. We focus on practical skills in the classroom, heavy coaching and mentoring up front, because we believe that's what's going to make the stronger teachers in the long run, right? But we don't have a course focused on we don't have a single course. A lot of programs now have here's a course on the TPA and let me help you. We have not previously had a course on that. We're starting it this year knowing that candidates on our internal surveys, right? Candidates, the only low scores we get are we need more support on the actual TPA because they see it as something outside of the program.
Right.
We do embed the skills needed, but we're not teaching to the test.
Exactly.
Two very different things. So what we're doing based off survey data this year is we're teaching to the test because candidates are asking for help on it. So we created a course on it based off candidate feedback. So it's just these interesting dichotomies, like when we're thinking about the ecosystems that was called out yesterday, in terms of how things can adjust and I don't know if what we're doing is a good or a bad idea, because it's maybe taking away. I understand the skills in the TPA need to be the skills in a classroom. But I also think there's a difference between a high stakes test and doing these 3 things in 5 minutes. And right, then what a person might generally address a lesson, how they might normally do it outside of that assessment cycle. Does that make sense?
I like what you said though, in terms of, I think it was what you've been, when you say growing teachers.
Yeah,
Is that what we're trying to do?
that is.
And how does this assessment fit into that particular concept, right?
That was gonna be one of the questions that I posed, was that if your program is not preparing your pre-service teachers to be successful on this assessment, then what is the purpose of your program? Is it to just produce a pre-service teacher? But
Yes.
then I don't know if the assessment is necessary because
Right.
they're gonna enter an induction program that might be a better fit to
Right.
assess and to do I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Like
no, it
the
does. Yeah,
pre-service
absolutely.
program should be
Yes.
preparing them for a career in education, but maybe the induction program that are differentiated according to context might be a better gauge to figure out whether or not they're going to. I don't know if that's fair though, because then, folks are putting in a lot of work, but that's my question would be like, if your program is not going to ensure that the candidate is prepared to adequately be assessed to pass the TPA, then what are you doing? And if that conversation.
And is
Right.
that necessary?
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
is that
I
again
agree.
the purpose, right?
Is that the purpose?
that
of
what
the
it
program?
is?
From my vantage point, that's not the purpose of my program.
Ah,
The purpose of my program is to get high quality
There you go.
teachers to support students within and there is a test that happens outside of that. But it's like with CASP, right? Like if I'm a teacher, I could look at the CASP blueprint, do nothing but test prep for a full year in a classroom.
Yeah.
Is that something anyone does? And why not, right? It's the same exact philosophy if I take that outside of this context, because are the measures of the TPA, this is really a question, or is the TPA measuring what creates a very strong teacher in a classroom? Potentially. I think certain elements, learning targets are super important. Every single person in my program knows what a learning target is, understands the reason why it's important, and success criteria, right?
right.
But that is not what the test is. That's an element of the test. And so similar to the CASP, you have all these different questions. I would argue there's a lot of very important elements in the TPA for all new teachers. But if you ask me, is the purpose of my program to pass a test? That's similar to how when I was a teacher, I would say that is not the purpose of the CASP. Like I'm not just preparing them for the CASP, I'm preparing them for life.
Can I step forward and ask for a bit of clarification?
Yeah.
So I'm hearing the assessment is not the coursework, although sometimes it is the coursework.
Correct.
Getting back to the language here on handout 1-2, page 2. Recommendations for how programs might embed the assessment.
Right.
The wording is not preparation for the assessment.
Right.
It is
The actual assessment.
the actual assessment. So just to kind of refocus a little bit here, my understanding is that there is an end goal assessment. But the conversation we're having right now is embedding the assessment into coursework. Is that a question that we need to ask? In terms of if it is at the end, that is not embedded, right? That is extraneous.
Right.
And so, I guess my question is, because we're talking a lot about the how and how people feel about it, but like, is the language here actually accurate to what is occurring?
Or is
Does
it?
that make sense?
Yeah,
Because the language here says is embedded in coursework, which I took initially I initially understood it as, is this something that can be taken over by universities, scored on site, built into programs to demonstrate mastery throughout the arc of your credentialing program, as opposed to a single summative,
Right.
which we know developmentally, those are two different things in terms of learning.
Yeah.
And the language here says embedded. And so I guess, just to refocus on that language, and I guess it isn't so much a shared understanding with this possible attributes, although we are noting that the attribute doesn't match the language. Because it doesn't say embed preparation for the assessment. The language says embed the assessment. And so I think like that would be a question to follow up on is, where's the disconnect?
And are we understanding it the way they are intending?
Am I understanding?
Yeah, you're right. That's
Correctly?
true.
'Cause I'm,
And I think taking on some of the critique with the TPA is the fact that your program is graduating someone who over here is being told they're not
Ready.
ready.
Mhm.
I feel like that critique is valid and it's a disservice to the pre-service teachers and to our educational community in general, because it's if you're giving two different messages where here it's like you're going to embed the actual assessment in a clear way where like the candidate understands that they're going through these steps to be able to meet this, as opposed to how it is now where it's kind of thrown in at the end. But I don't.
So I want to just jump in for a minute because I think this is a really critical clarification that we have to be sure everybody in the whole work group understands. In addition to, I think this sentence, embed the assessment, is drilling down what's a very big concept in program standards and what programs are all supposed to be doing. And there are standards around preparing the candidates for the assessment throughout the program. And that is the totality of embedding the assessments. And even if the TPA, and again, it depends on which of the three different TPAs your program is using. One of them, the Ed TPA, the actual assessment event occurs at one point. Whereas some of the others, they occur at different points. There's pieces that occur at different points. But for all of them, the program standards state that the programs have to be preparing the candidates all along the way with the experiences, scaffolding, supports, et cetera. And many kinds of assessments until they do, whatever it is. And so anyways, that is the intent, I believe, always of what embedded is. But I think, Kathleen, it's a great question that you have. We have to be sure everybody understands that.
Yeah.
And so that's where programs, so like I said, we never had a course for the TPA, but like each of our courses are dealing with the concepts of the TPA, lesson plan templates that might look very similar to lesson plan templates. But we cannot, as a program, this is also important to call out, provide any feedback to the candidate on the TPA, right? We can ask the questions. So like the reason why we do all the preparation for it is so those preparation pieces we can give feedback on. So
Right.
now hopefully when they see the actual TPA, they have an idea of how to deal with it more appropriately, even though it's like a more high stakes assessment.
And then that's just a time check on the first 15 minutes.
I love that question though.
I do too.
It's absolutely germane. What do you mean by that?
I think too, the other big question that we should have some common understanding of is what does it mean to teach to the test?
Yeah, that part,
Mhm.
that part.
Because,
Absolutely.
and I think this goes back to the authenticity and appropriateness and validity question. If you have an assessment of teaching that we all can agree is very authentic and valid, and it allows candidates to demonstrate their practice in a way that we can say, you're ready to go teach, then I think teaching to the test is just fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're teaching to something that we all agree on. We want to be sure we can see our candidates demonstrating before we let them off into the world with kids on their own. But what does that mean, teach to the test?
Right.
Yeah, it's back to that question of the purpose.
Right.
What is the purpose? Are we growing teachers? What are we doing? Because if the assessment is meant to be a licensure gatekeeper, that's a totally different ballgame.
Right.
Now, if we're talking about growing a teacher, if we're talking about the arc of their profession, making sure they're ready to go into a classroom, then I think, like you're saying, Tina, I don't think teaching to the test is a problem, because our goal is to help you be ready. And if we're giving you feedback along the way, and if it's truly embedded into the program,
Right.
there's nothing wrong with that, right?
And
Right.
that's exactly what I mean by like my program does not teach the test. We give feedback and we're trying to grow teachers.
Right.
If I taught to the test, I would tell people, hey, here's a test hack.
Right.
Have you thought about
Exactly.
scripting out what you want to say and putting it in the 5-minute time window? Have you thought about like
Here's the
where you
vocabulary.
right? Like so I would those are the hacks on how to take a test and succeed.
Mhm.
That is not what we do,
Mhm.
right? We focus on how to grow the teacher, which are two different things.
Right. Absolutely.
Well, I would argue, Ben, that what you're doing is also teaching to the test.
It is. It's just not like when I think of like CASP prep or back in the day, you remember when we had the CASP, what was the before the CASP?
The Casey.
The case, that was the high school exam. There was also,
Yeah.
but there was the STAR, I don't remember. But like, so like 2 weeks before that STAR test, as an English teacher, I'd front load grammar and vocabulary. We'd go over how to eliminate answers and how to,
Oh, the
and that's
SAT
like,
prep.
to me, that was
Yeah.
test prep,
Yeah,
right?
SAT test.
That is
Test
test prep. How do you
preparation.
take this test well?
That's right.
So when I'm saying test prep, I'm thinking, here's the tips and tricks to take and succeed on this test. And I could easily do that. I don't choose to spend our time that way. I'd rather turn out strong teachers who will stay in the career, have the tips and tricks in the classroom, and that's where we dedicate our time. You see what I'm saying?
Oh, absolutely.
I'm just going to clarify then, Ben, test preparation versus teaching and formative experience, teaching to the test. The formative experience is the embedding of my view or understanding of teaching to the test or the formative experiences, we might use the same language that the TPA use. We might call,
Yes.
maybe they call it learning objectives, and we'll
Yes.
use that language instead of learning targets, because maybe that would be confusing to a candidate. You know,
Exactly.
we use the language of the rubrics to help them
Exactly.
describe their practice and help them evaluate their practice using that same language. To me, those would be the formative experiences. And we would provide them as a program because we think those are good experiences to learn how to teach.
Yes, we follow the program common standards and preconditions and all that. Like, I want to make sure that part's clear, but I just mean to say we're teaching how to teach well, which overlaps with a lot of the concepts of the test, but we don't teach those are two different concepts in my mind. Do you see what I'm saying? So like the test is how to churn out good teachers, right? How to create good teachers. We are focused on how to create good teachers. And there are times that overlaps with the test, but we're not directly teaching to how to take the test well.
And can I just kind of to add on and
I
kind of
agree with you, Tina. We're saying the same thing.
narrow our focus a little bit? I hear both of you kind of motioning towards part B, which is avoiding duplicative work, but instead aligning language, aligning expectations, and kind of trying to find ways to engage in the valuable work in the very little time that we have with early career teachers. And so I heard Tina say, like, the idea that like we have that common like learning objective so that it moves forward and supports So, right, when I think of avoiding duplicative work, I think of using shared language. But are there other thoughts about when we think about embedding the assessments, how we may avoid duplicative work?
I was looking at it or thinking, I was gonna ask for clarification on this, because what I'm thinking when they say duplicative work, and when we think about that in the context of embedding.
I know, I agree with you.
I am
Exact
really
same thought.
trying to figure out like, okay, well, what should be assessed in this assessment? And then what should be in the auspices of the program?
Because
What, you know what I'm saying? Like, what concept can you assess effectively on the assessment and get an idea of how well a candidate knows or does this thing? Or is that something that is much more in line with a programmatic type of situation? You know, because again, you know, inside the accreditation process, you have the assessments. So
Mhm.
does a program's key assessment measure certain things? And then are those same things being measured in the TPA? So is that duplicative work?
Well, that's what Tina and I were just
Right?
talking about. Like, it feels like to me, the whole nature of the assessment is duplicative work because they're doing a very similar lesson plan template with coaching feedback, practicing on learning targets, like throughout the course of the program, and they're just duplicating it again and again and again. Does that make sense?
So is that practice, or are we really calling it duplicative? I'm thinking of in terms of the assessment, am I assessing you here? And that's what I mean, you know, like
Yeah.
all the good points you guys are making about it going through the program and how does that embedding look? Because are you really giving that feedback?
Right.
Or is this something that's just being assessed right here at this snapshot in time,
Yes. Right.
right?
I think that's a really critical point, Kathy, that you're making. One of the problems I think we have with performance assessment in California is people have this understanding that it is a gatekeeper like a bar, and it is supposed to be everything. It's supposed to assess everything a new teacher is supposed to know because that's just what it is. But that's not. That's not what the language, the statute language says. That's not how they are created. It can measure. It's one measure used in a program to identify whether a candidate is ready to be credentialed in the state of California. It's one of the measures. It is a standardized
Pretty big
measure.
one.
But it's-
Yeah, I mean, the realities are,
But that makes
That
total
is the
sense,
intent.
Tina. You're right. You're absolutely right. But then again, if that's going to be the case, then it should not be licensure dependent. Meaning you should not, like you guys were saying in terms of, is this program preparing a teacher to be ready to go?
Right.
Or are we trying to have it be a gatekeeper?
and it's,
I mean, I
and
don't
the
know.
purpose of it is it's one of many. Why can't it be that everyone
Right.
gets a pass
Yep.
on a specific continuum, and then it is on the onus is on their induction program to take them from where they're at to where they need to be. You know, with that understanding that you're receiving this candidate at this particular point, as opposed to what we get now, which is they haven't passed it.
Right.
Well, that's not very helpful, because
Right.
they need to pass it first, but that still doesn't tell me where they're at and where they need to be, for the context of where they're teaching. So why can't it be an assessment that we all take, but yet we all are not prevented from licensure?
Yeah, why not move it to the clear?
I just realized.
I mean, honestly, I mean, if you're saying beginning teacher and you've got, because we have this structure where we understand, in California, we say preliminary credential,
Yeah.
right? And we say clear at the end, 5 years, whatever.
Right.
And you do your induction program.
Yeah.
If you really think about it, we've got it backwards, because if we're talking about growing a teacher and making sure you're ready to enter a classroom and ready to learn and keep going professionally,
Right.
then your induction program needs to be those 5 years. And at the end, that's where you have your high stakes,
Yeah.
if you were gonna do something
I
like
called
that,
out, I
right?
grew the most as a teacher in year 3.
Yeah.
Like year 3 is where I finally found my stride and understood what I was doing. And so I do think it's always interesting, like admin wise, tenure rules, right? Tenure rules, 2 years. And I'm like, I feel like they're on the cusp, right? This is a candidate I want to keep. Same thing here, right? Like it's measuring someone similar to what Tina and I were just saying, right? If we as a program have a bunch of formative checks along the way, and then this is it is measuring all TPE domains.
Right.
Because I've seen the rubrics and I know it is.
Right.
So if that's the case, it becomes a summative assessment by nature because you're measuring a variety of standards that you've been practicing within a program over and over continuously with very little feedback that now controls like a high stakes licensure. And so that's exactly, to me, that's where it's interesting, the embedding, the formative, I'm so sorry, definitely you need to talk, Kathleen.
No, I think I appreciate the optimism of how it could be better, first and foremost. The second is, because we have this particular assessment, but then we also have induction after, which has been brought up. And so when we think of duplicative, the vibe in the world is that induction is just this over again, right? And I'm just gonna put it out there, because it is said, and from my perspective as a classroom educator who supports induction candidates, like, that is, right, okay, and so, I can only build an analogy, to, something like national board, where, and I hate the word mastery, because we have feelings about Marzano's self-referential research. Sorry, Marzano, if you ever watch this. But like, if we have people who are indicating mastery, at one point, why are we duplicating? Right, and so if we're thinking about formative as an arc, if we're thinking about formative as building upon and maintaining, how can someone completely fail something for not reaching mastery on one part? Right, instead of taking their, I have mastery here, here, and here, and in order to be fully credentialed, I need mastery here, 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 and here. And that sense of transparency makes so much more sense. And it also might deal with some issues of we're coming in and we don't know what mastery they have. So we're gonna dump them all into the induction pot, and they might self-report
Exactly.
what they need, but honestly, they're gonna pick the goal that's the easiest.
The one that they feel they're strong.
Right, which is always ed tech and classroom management.
Right.
Always.
Yep.
Yes.
And no one ever focuses on the professionalism standards or anything like that because they don't know how. So I think when we think about avoiding duplicative work for candidates, my question is, like, structurally, how ambitious is this project? Right, because structurally, there is a great deal of duplicative work that makes it not blended, not ongoing, right? But instead, summative, right? And instead, duplicative in the nature of if you don't hit the whole thing, you redo the whole thing, right? And okay, I'm almost done. And and then I'm giving you a question, so I'm sorry. To what extent is this idea of duplicative work pushing out people on people who are less financially able to participate?
Right.
Right? People who for various reasons have other constraints. Right, because I think the duplicative nature of the work is pushing out certain populations. And I'm guessing, so I'm asking, is it pushing out certain populations of educators?
I mean, it could.
Right.
I think in some cases it probably does. I guess I keep going back to trying to figure out exactly what we're talking about when we say duplicative.
I am too, yeah.
I'm kind
It's
of,
the same idea with formative, right? Like,
yeah, what do I mean by that exactly?
I agree, because Kathy, I think you asked a good question. Kathleen, that you asked some really good questions just now. What is duplicative in the assessment? If they don't pass one part of it and they have to do the whole thing again, that seems duplicative. So that's one way of looking at it for sure. Then the other question is the formative work that we're giving them, is it duplicative or is it practice? I think you used that word, Kathy. You said, is it practice or is it just being redundant and duplicative? And then the third sort of concept I'm hearing about duplicative is the duplicative that the program is assessing the same things as the TPA, and they're just doing it in a different way, but candidates are having to do both things, and it feels duplicative to programs and candidates.
And I think this is gonna be the pause, because I think it's.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we have 2 minutes. So if I could go ahead and point out that I think we have brainstormed possible attributes. And we have identified some questions. And we tend to like combine what we know,
Yeah.
and that's okay. If we are allowed to return, I don't know. Could we return back to finalizing our questions, identifying sources, and kind of packing up any other attributes we wanted to add?
Yes,
Because
please.
we didn't necessarily talk about feasible.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's a big one.
Huge. That's just huge.
It's so fun. Blended into the preparation program, again, with this idea of if it's an end assessment, how can it possibly, if the programs aren't scoring it, right? If we can't give feedback, how's it? So I think we probably still need to unpack C a little bit if we're allowed to come back. And if we don't, I'll dream about it tonight, so that's fine too. Thank you all so much. Is there anything we need to just final, like it's on the tip of your tongue right now? I don't want to cut anyone off.
I have one
Yeah, there.
keeps coming up for me, and that is what do we, how standardized of a TPA do we need in the context of all of the assessments that a program provides? So if the program is responsible for ensuring that they are assessing all of the TPEs, and they can do that in their own local contexts on a local level, then there's the performance assessment does need to be standardized across contexts so that we have some understanding that people, no matter what program they're going in, they're meeting a set of expectations and standards prior to going into the field. So the big question is what needs to be standardized and what can be localized.
Agreed.
And what does standardized mean, I guess, is my other one.
Yeah.
Is there more flexibility in a standardized performance assessment than we're currently doing?
Good question.
Very good.
Good questions.
Important questions.
All right, let's go back. It's 11:50.
Let's go back.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hopefully we come back.
I would.
I'm sure we're gonna be
Yeah,
back.
I think so.
I
I'm still gonna
suspect
take
that the
all
other
my
groups
stuff.
didn't have much,
Yeah.
No.
getting all the way through everything either.
We've done a good effort, that's right.
We
I'm
did, we did.
not ashamed of that.
We tried.
Yeah.
We did. We tried.
Any resources we'd like for focus areas too? And then maybe take a moment to recap, because we don't see each other for a few weeks, and I want to make sure we have stuff to work with next time.
Good
Although,
idea.
okay, great. Hi, Tina.
Oh, hey,
Hi.
you scared me.
Sorry. I've been here.
Glad you're here. So just to let you know, because I know you were in the big room with us, we have, it's half an hour, because we're going in at 15, to kind of wrap up where we need to be, but also to share,
Right.
to plan to share with everyone else. Yes, we go in at 15. And so, what if we spent 10 minutes just kind of wrapping up two? Is that okay? And then move forward? Because I feel like we didn't talk about a couple things for two. Would that be acceptable? 10 minutes isn't a ton of time. Okay. Thank you for just mind holding us accountable, because
10 minutes. No.
yeah. So to return to focus area 2, are we ready to identify questions, or would we like to flesh out feasible?
I think we have some questions.
Yeah.
Based on what I like, the whole end was a decent amount of questions.
Great.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah, I
to-
feel like we did ask a lot of questions in the discussion.
Yeah.
We were kind of, yeah, in the discussion, we were doing questions and all kind of at once, I
Yeah.
feel like.
Okay, great. And so thinking about as we move forward with this process, what materials do we need to understand the ideas of embedding assessments, avoiding duplicative work, and a feasible kind of ongoing blended assessment?
So I think one resource would be the handbook to the TPA I mean, if we're talking about
Yeah.
embedding, whatever is embedded or, how it's paced and whatnot. I guess that would be a good resource, just to understand, and I guess maybe what the policy is. And I still need to know, the question we asked before about what do they mean by embedded? I need to understand that a little bit better. So whatever resource we can get for that, I don't know if it's gonna come from a standard or a policy or what, but I do feel like we need to kind of understand that better. At least I feel like I need a more clear understanding of what they mean by that before I can kind of move forward and dig into inquiries about how, I guess, or to what extent or whatever. That's all.
I agree. The actual policy document that outlines what embedding is as of right now would be really, if there is one.
And, because I guess from designing the one TPA, there were decisions made about what would be assessed on the TPA and what would be assessed within the program. So, but those are very specific to one assessment. So again, is there a blanket policy that talks about that or how that's broken out? That makes sense?
That does make sense, and I think that clarification would be helpful.
I think another thing, and I don't know how we do this, but it keeps coming up. What are the best practices from institutions that are doing it well? That question keeps coming up. And with respect to embedding the work of the performance assessment, there's a lot of writing out there on this. There are a lot of self-studies, I think, from programs. There are a lot of people have written about what they've done in their own practice. There are a lot just from all of the conferences that are held each year, like the Cal TPA conferences, the Ed TPA conferences. People are describing their practices all the time. That we should know something about those. But the challenge, I think, is gathering, not just gathering them, but synthesizing them and summarizing them in some digestible way for us.
It's a perfect thing. We would
Yeah.
do that.
I appreciate the suggestion of like synthesis and digestion so that we have actual time to do things with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate
That's
that.
great. Thank you, Tina. That's a good suggestion.
I'd like to offer up something because I was thinking over our break. In both focus area 1 and 2, and I don't really mind where this material goes. I would like us to have at least a brief moment where we consider the impact on students. And so in terms of, has there been any research done about when a student teacher is doing multiple assessments, if anything happens to student achievement? Does it impact their relationship with students? And somebody had to do a dissertation at some point on this. I don't want to go back to grad. But does that make sense? Like, I think missing from this conversation and the subtext is always what's best for students. And I'm wondering too, as far as like embedding assessments, we think often of the college students and what's best for them. And I agree, we should ask what's best for those students, mentally and emotionally and career-wise, but also the young people in classrooms. If we have any insights to that, I would like to keep that in mind. 5 minutes.
That is a great question because that's what all this is for.
I have one. If there's anything that exists already where we can see maybe the comparison between like a TPA and an induction program. I know that we do that in so like I work with induction mentees and I give them the teacher learning framework and the California State Teacher Performance Standards, right? And so then they can kind of align their district requirements with the induction program as much as possible. So does something like that exist where we can see a comparison between a TPA and maybe the induction program that they're gonna do right after?
Hmm,
Something like that.
yeah,
I don't know what the comparison would be, but like,
That's a great question, though.
like a
Yes.
or something, I don't know.
And
Well,
sometimes,
But something.
I would actually argue it gets easier with induction. I might be way off, but that's a really good question. Sorry, Tina.
I was just gonna say, Talia, I think that is such a critical question. You keep bringing up this alignment for the better use of induction after pre-service. And I just think that's something that we really, really have to look at. And the way that you all have said this, the way that programs are and candidates are taking what they've done in pre-service and taking them over to induction just is across the map. I mean, it's just going every which way. And is it as effective as we want it to be? How can we understand a little bit better what is actually happening with how they're using the performance assessments in induction, and then how are they aligned, or what can we learn from that? I mean, I'm not exactly saying what you're saying, Talia, but I really appreciate that point because I think we really need to look into induction. I'm going to ask, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just in agreement. Yes. Continue,
Okay.
please.
I wanted to add one more thing. I was thinking about this idea of embedding. And again, this is one of those questions. They've turned it into a very short question, but it really is bigger in some ways, because one of the things that we've always wanted, and what came up yesterday a lot, is for this assessment to be educative. And educative, not just for the candidates doing it, but educative for the program and the mentors and the faculty who are doing it, to learn about how teacher candidates are doing and have some evidence for what they're doing. And when programs, what we do know is we know that programs embed the work in so many different ways. Some of them only have a handful of faculty involved, and others have everyone involved. And what does being involved mean? And particularly if we're looking at local scoring, this is a long-winded preamble to my question, which is, I know that one of the things that greatly affects who participates, how they participate, and whether they participate in the institution has to do with the organizational structures of those institutions. So in other words, at a UC, people who are, on the tenure track, their primary purpose is to do research. They don't get any credit for scoring TPAs in their promotion and tenure. That's an organizational structure that constrains the ability for faculty to be involved. What are these organizational structures that are supporting and constraining the embedding of the TPA?
So with a minute or so left, before we close out kind of focus area 2 and think about how we'll present area 1 and 2 to our colleagues, I was wondering, Ben, do you mind reading back to us kind of the big points?
On 2?
For 2?
Yeah.
And we can check.
So these are the big points I have currently for 2. So please add anything if something is missing. Okay. If it were truly embedded, the assessments, they would need to happen over a longer period of time, chunked out, parsed out over the entire student, teacher, intern experience. The programs that do a great job, they embed it and make it clear. They know what standard and what part of the standard they are addressing when they do something. They make it clear how everything relates to the TPA. Programs need equity on how to prepare candidates. What is the purpose of the assessment? Is it about growing teachers? Is it about other things than that? Should induction be assessing the measures? Is it more appropriate for beginning teachers if induction, for instance, was looking at these types of questions? Sorry, I lost my spot. Are there times a program graduates someone who is not ready, regardless of how they do on the TPA, right? Program standards focus on preparing candidates for the assessment, not embedding the assessment. Ed TPA occurs at one point in time. What does it mean to teach to the test, an assessment on teaching that is authentic and valid. Are you ready to teach? This is what I have. Avoid duplicative work, shared language, question mark. Clarification, what should be on the assessment and what should be in like the program, right? So I was talking about the duplicative work. Why not move it to the clear credential? Why are we duplicating? If formative is an arc and building upon / maintaining, how can someone be scored not mastery? How can someone be scored not mastery in one part? So that's something you called out, like one part of the rubric may not be mastery, and so they have to redo all the work, right? Structurally, how ambitious is this project? There's a great deal of duplicative work that makes it not blend in, not ongoing, but summative. Duplicative, if you do not do well on one thing, you redo the whole thing to what extent? So that doesn't make sense. Is the idea of duplicative work pushing out people who are financially less able to participate or have other constraints? Is it pushing out certain populations? What does duplicative mean? Is the formative work redundant, duplicative, or practice? Is the duplicative the program assessing the same things as the TPA? How standardized of a TPA do we need when we're talking about across programs? What needs to be standardized and what can be localized? What does standardized mean? Finally, in the more recent part, we talked about resource needed would be the handbook for the TPA, information on what the policy is with embedded. What do we mean by embedded? Policy documents would be helpful in how it's broken out. What are the best practices from institutions that are doing it well? The challenge is gathering and synthesizing these best practices into a digestible manner. Can that be provided like in that format? Consider the impact on TK through 12 students and not the interns or student teachers, but like on the actual students. Are there studies on the relational aspects in the classroom or student achievement in the impact on student achievement? Can we see the comparison between a TPA and the induction program's end result? So I put PGP in parentheses because that's what my program calls it, but I don't know if that's the name for it across the board. How can we understand with how our teachers are using the performance assessment results in induction? What does being involved mean when we're talking about faculty and who's involved? And then I clarified that underneath, what are the organizational structures that are constraining or restraining the TPA? Is there anything substitute? Not everything's blending together. There's no like, because that's how our conversation was. Is there anything missing big idea point for focus area 2?
I think you did an absolutely excellent job, Ben. Did we ask the question about, well, I think we probably did ask this in one, where we talked about the validity or the authenticity, I guess, on what we're actually trying to measure. Is the TPA supposed to be measuring the program's effectiveness or the candidate's readiness or both?
I think it's both.
I think it's both too. But I feel as if sometimes we don't have the information necessary to answer some of the deeper questions, I guess. I think we asked those in one, if I'm not mistaken.
And if not, we can.
I'll add it to one,
Yeah.
just in case, just to make sure.
If we didn't.
And I think we would probably have gotten into that more in focus area 3 when we were talking about the accreditation system, at least with respects to measuring programs,
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
perhaps. We'll get a chance for that. I just want to propose one thing about focus area 2. And I've said it this a couple of times. In some ways, the question that focus area 2 is asking is rather reductive when we're just looking at recommendations for how programs might embed the assessments to avoid duplicative work. Duplicative, I know, comes up all the time in how people are talking about this. But maybe instead of just avoiding duplicative work, maybe the question should be slightly different, such as recommendations that consider adaptations or modifications to the TPA instruments that provide opportunities for programs to innovate or build curriculum, rather than just simply embed the TPA, avoid duplicative work, and then work around the TPA to do what the program really wants to do.
So recommendations that consider adaptations or modifications to TPA instruments that allow programs to innovate and develop curricula. Is that what you're kind of saying surrounding the work? I want to make sure I'm interpreting correctly.
Yeah, rather than sort of sticking the TPA in there, avoiding duplicative work, and then doing something else that the program really wants to do. I had a colleague say that the TPA was sort of this boulder in the middle of a creek. They had to get over it, but then everything else they were doing was going around it.
Yeah.
And I don't, in the scheme of things, I don't think that's what we want.
Right, right. I don't think it's how it was intended.
I think you're right, Ben.
Mhm.
Cool. So shall we start diving? Is there anything else for 2?
Sorry, Ben, I was looking at this. Did you ask the question, about standardization? How standardized does it need to be?
What needs to be standardized and what can be localized? What does standardize?
Thank you. Perfect, sorry.
You're good, don't worry. I mean, it's
Presentation.
also hard because it's all auditory. Like, I wish I could share this. I did it in a Word document and I'm happy to put it in Teams or Drive so everyone has access. Because right now it's not accessible.
Mhm.
Whatever people prefer.
So that being said, given our time constraints, thinking about presenting out kind of the biggest, most salient ideas from most likely focus area 1, then 2, or in combination with both. Does it make sense? So I kind of started thinking about moving backwards because we just recapped it. A couple thematic things that we might comment on for area 2.
Yeah.
And then some comments underneath them, and then maybe we can do a couple thematic things for area 1. So we're not just going bullet point by bullet point because I think that will not be the best use of our time. Although if you want to fight me on that, we can.
I
Fine,
think that-
sure, let's do it. So for 2, because you just read it to us, I thought maybe I'd recap the thematic things I have that we might present. So it seems that when we think about 2, our 2 big thematic structures are equity and format. We're looking for programs that are equitable and responsible to people's needs. And then we're looking for formats that are built into that kind of understanding of our value of equity. And so as far as equity goes, we're thinking a lot about how programs and participation may or may not differ when it comes to how the assessment's embedded and how it may or may not be duplicative. And then as far as format goes, because that was kind of the bulk of our conversation, is it standardized or localized? It was one of the first things I wrote down because I agree that's really important. Is it responsive to learner needs? Right? And kind of beneath that, like, is it recursive or responsive in some way in terms of a process where someone is learning and receiving feedback? Or is it simply a process that must be duplicated when it has failed? And I think that speaks to the idea of repetition a little bit. That's very little for a 1-hour conversation. And then I think our questions kind of illuminate more of the conversation. What can we know about learner data? Who is successful, who is sustaining? Program data, what are the successful faculty doing? What are the successful programs doing? And kind of in opposition, what's going wrong at other places, although that's a Pandora's box. And then ultimately, student data. And so what impacts are we having on the students in our classrooms? And that's like my little special precious thing. I feel like that doesn't though speak enough to our conversation about embedding.
Maybe.
Embedding was the one that
No, it's.
Is it two? I'm so sorry, everything's.
No,
yeah.
blurring. That's why I'm saying it's really hard to like distill everything into 5 minutes.
What was the prompt, or what is the prompt when they say to share out, or did they give us a prompt to share out? They just said share out however you want to share out?
I mean, we could
Yeah.
do a dance number.
They said
Right?
5
Yeah.
minutes. Yeah, they said.
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Maybe it might be faster, like you were saying just now, to kind of share out about the words that we kind of had to go roundabout with, like
Mhm.
embedded.
Mhm.
And what was the other one we went around about? No,
Duplicative,
and there was a,
standardized,
no, there was authentic.
authentic. Yeah.
Yeah. So when we share out about,
Yes.
maybe, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what they're looking for in share out.
Reasonable.
Yeah, reasonable. I
I
feel like,
do. Oh, go ahead.
go ahead, Tina.
I was just gonna say, I like the thematic idea because I could grasp that a little better. When Kathleen was talking, here are two big chunks, your two themes. And then within those, so I thought you were, just keep going, Kathleen. We can add to those themes. Sorry, Kathy, what were you gonna say?
Oh, no, nothing. That's good.
No, but I think to your point, like, I think when we talk about the struggles that we have with part two, I think it's important to say that, like, with embedded, like really clarifying that is the work that we need to do. And duplicative. Clarifying that point is gonna be a big chunk, I think, of the work of this work group. And authentic will be work, right? That is the work of the work group. And I think by like emphasizing that those are the terms, of course, we're echoing back to what the call is.
Right.
But also like we're in agreement that will need to happen. And then, he said suspend your desire to fix it today. Right, which we don't have to. You don't have to today.
You can also end up trying to fix the wrong problem if you're not clear on what the
What
problem
it
is,
is,
right?
yeah.
We have precisely 5 minutes to recap one and make notes.
4.5.
Do you want me to read one? What do you want my next step to be? Or our next step to be?
So thematically for focus area 1. Maybe you should read it back to us, because now I'm looking at this and it all looks like Greek.
Okay, I'm gonna go fast.
Okay.
Organic, flexible, cannot be static. A one day, one shot may not be the most authentic thing in terms of scope. We need to have it based on like teacher needs, like having a lesson plan, reflection and honesty, like an honest process, right? About what worked and what didn't. It should not feel like a checklist. Instead, it should be like skills in the classroom. It does not need to be perfect. It should be reflective. Teaching what they would normally do in an organic way, flexibility related to what happens on a daily basis. You cannot anticipate your students' mindset on a given day. Honest on what worked and what didn't, something built into not just a check off a list. I think that was the summary Tina gave of that whole first section. And then underneath it was a bunch of questions. So formative is the chance for the program to support the candidate who has the best knowledge on what needs to happen. Continuum of teaching CSTP, continuum describing, so there's a lot about continuum and ARC. Continuum describing practice at different levels of sophistication. Pre-service and different continuum and in-service. We need a common ARC. Rubrics can be overwhelming. Authentic, benchmarks over time, chunked, iterative process, timely feedback. Reasonable. Right? And that was localized based on best practices. Candidates are not at the disservice if they do not know certain types of classrooms or a certain type of assignment or student specific. And that was already 2 minutes. So even though I'm only halfway done, part of me thinks I'm a little worried. Yeah, so I'm gonna stop.
Okay, so my thematic word that I'm looking for might be authentic. Hear me out, because we want it to be organic, we want it to be skills-based, we want it to be honest and reflective, we want it to be localized, we want it to be human. And so if the concept of focus area 1 is that this is an authentic assessment, right? You need to decide what assessment is. Then our questions are, is there an arc of preparation that responds to learner needs? Should the arc be widened? Right, and I'm thinking also, do we need to adjust based on the learners we have in front of us now in 2024? Now that we have data and what data we have. I'm open to another thematic concept though. In 2 minutes. You guys, I'm so sorry.
No, you're fine.
Yeah.
Oh. I wonder, I'm thinking about our conversation around this. I feel like number 2, we really did need some themes because we went kind of a lot of different places. The first one we really did take the 4 areas of concepts and really try to flesh them out. The concepts being authentic, the concept formative in nature, reasonable and appropriate. We had a lot of discussions around what that meant for us, the kinds of things we think it means, but that's something that we think everybody needs to continue to flesh out. And then I think we had a lot of very good questions that we need to ask to, better understand those 4 things. And then I think we had a whole list of resources we think might be very helpful.
You just want me to read the bold underlined things as it lays for section 1 and then section 2 do the themes?
We could. As well as the resources.
Yes.
Time. It's time for us to return.
I think we're presenting last. Just saying, because our boxes were last. So we'll be like, everything they said,
We agree.
we agree.
Plus.
Good job, everybody. Plus. So we can like check off as we go.
And that might be a good approach, to hear what everybody else, because they probably all had the same types of discussions.
Yeah, they probably.
Yeah.
And then just add if we have anything
Yeah.
that was missing.
And I'm all about, have you ever been in a meeting and somebody's like to echo and you're like, girl, nobody needed that echo. Heard it.
Yeah, that's true.
Kate is
That'd be
definitely the
fab.
enforcer.
So every time I hear echo, I'm gonna look at
Kate is gonna enforce these norms, man.
I should be in the room.
Thank you.
Sorry. If I echo. I echo.
I echo what your sentiment.
Yeah.